Welcome to How Bizarre. How Bizarre. Welcome. In this episode, we'll be returning to part 2 of Mothman lore. So please get comfortable, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Now that you have some background on Mothman, let's take a step back and talk about the Point Pleasant Silver Bridge collapse that was mentioned in the previous episode. Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse, a deep dive into the connection. The legend of Mothman is inextricably linked to the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on December 15, 1967. This disaster, which claimed 46 lives, remains one of the deadliest bridge collapses in U.S. history. While the official cause of the collapse was determined to be a structural failure due to a cracked eye-bar, many believe that Mothman's sightings in the year leading up to the catastrophe were an omen or warning of the impending tragedy. The connection between Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse has been explored in books, documentaries, and urban legends. Some claim that Mothman was a supernatural harbinger of disaster, while others suggest it was somehow directly involved. Still, skeptics argue that the link is purely coincidental. In this comprehensive analysis, we will examine a variety of details about this event, including the history of the Silver Bridge disaster, eyewitness accounts of Mothman before the collapse, theories about Mothman's role in the disaster, paranormal and prophetic connections, alternative explanations and skeptical views, Mothman's continued connection to disasters, and the cultural and media influence on the Mothman legend. The history of the Silver Bridge. The Silver Bridge was a suspension bridge that connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to Gallipolis, Ohio, spanning the Ohio River. Built in 1928, it was named for the aluminum-colored paint that coated its steel structure. Design and structure. The bridge was a 2-lane suspension bridge measuring 1,760 feet long. It was supported by eye-bar chains, an innovative but later considered flawed design for the time. The bridge was built before modern safety regulations, meaning there was no redundancy in its design. If a single component failed, the entire bridge was at risk. Growing traffic and structural stress. By the 1960s, the traffic load had increased dramatically, with vehicles being heavier than the bridge was originally designed to accommodate. The increased stress on the bridge led to wear and tear on its components. The collapse on December 15, 1967. At approximately 5 p.m., the bridge was packed with rush hour traffic. A single eye-bar, number 330, on the Ohio side, fractured due to a small stress crack that had grown over time. The entire bridge collapsed in less than a minute, plunging dozens of vehicles into the icy waters of the Ohio River. 46 people died, and 2 bodies were never recovered. Mothman sightings leading up to the collapse. The connection between Mothman and the Silver Bridge disaster stems from numerous sightings of a mysterious winged humanoid in Point Pleasant in the months leading up to the tragedy. The first reported sighting, November 12, 1966. The first widely accepted Mothman sighting occurred in Clendenin, West Virginia, on November 12, 1966. 5 gravediggers reported seeing a large winged creature flying low over the cemetery. This sighting is considered the beginning of the Mothman legend. The Scarberry Mallet encounter, November 15, 1966. 3 days later, Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallet were driving near the TNT area, a former munitions plant, when they saw a large gray humanoid with glowing red eyes. It chased their car at speeds over 100 miles per hour. They later reported feeling an overwhelming sense of fear. Increasing reports throughout late 1966 to 1967. Over the next year, Numerous people reported seeing Mothman in and around Point Pleasant. Witnesses described a large, dark figure with wings spanning 10 to 15 feet. Red glowing eyes that seemed to paralyze or hypnotize those who looked into them. A silent, gliding flight pattern, often appearing suddenly. A strange sense of dread or telepathic warnings. Mothman sightings near the Silver Bridge. Several witnesses claimed to see Mothman perched on the Silver Bridge in the weeks leading up to the collapse. A few people reported seeing glowing red eyes in the fog near the bridge at night. One account suggested that Mothman was seen flying over the bridge the morning of the disaster. Theories about Mothman's role in the collapse. There are multiple theories regarding Mothman's connection to the Silver Bridge disaster. Some believe Mothman was a prophetic warning, while others suggest a more direct involvement. Mothman as a harbinger of doom. Many researchers believe that Mothman is a prophetic entity that appears before major disasters. Similar sightings of winged creatures have been reported before other tragic events, such as the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, 1986, the September 11th attacks, 2001, the Minneapolis I-35W bridge collapse, 2007. Mothman as a supernatural being. Some paranormal investigators theorize that Mothman is a spiritual or interdimensional being that appears during times of crisis. It may be an omen sent to warn people. It could be a guardian that failed to prevent the disaster. Some link Mothman to ultra-terrestrials or men in black sightings in Point Pleasant at the time. Mothman as a cause of the collapse. A more ominous theory is that Mothman directly caused the Silver Bridge collapse. Some claim its presence weakened the bridge through an unknown energy force. It landed on the bridge and disturbed the already fragile structure. It was a malevolent entity that caused the disaster intentionally. While the connection between Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse is compelling, skeptics argue that it is purely coincidental. The official cause of the collapse. The U.S. government investigation determined that the failure of a single eyebar caused the bridge collapse. The primary causes were stress corrosion cracking, lack of redundancy in the bridge design, increasing weight loads due to modern traffic. What are some psychological and cultural factors associated with the Mothman sightings? Mass hysteria and the spread of urban legends contributed to the rise of Mothman stories. Human tendency to find patterns. People connected two separate events, Mothman sightings and the bridge collapse, without direct evidence. The role of media and folklore in shaping perceptions of supernatural events. Mothman's continued connection to disasters. Even after the Silver Bridge collapse, Mothman sightings have been reported before other major catastrophes, including Chernobyl, 9/11 attacks, and the Minnesota Bridge collapse. The legacy of Mothman and the Silver Bridge. Despite the skepticism, the legend of Mothman remains a powerful part of Point Pleasant's history. The annual Mothman Festival hosts thousands of visitors who come to Point Pleasant each year. Books and films. The story was popularized by John Keel's 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, and its 2002 film adaptation. The connection between Mothman and the Silver Bridge collapse remains one of the most fascinating and debated topics in paranormal history. Whether an omen, a warning, or merely coincidence, Mothman has cemented itself as one of America's most enduring legends. Now that you know the history of Mothman, aren't you curious about how long this myth has been around? Me too. Let's take a look at Appalachia folklore. Scots-Irish folk tales and their connection to the Mothman legend. The legend of Mothman, A mysterious winged humanoid with glowing red eyes that terrorized Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the 1960s, bears a striking resemblance to several creatures found in Scottish and Irish folklore. These folk tales feature supernatural beings that serve as omens of disaster, winged creatures associated with death or misfortune, and mysterious otherworldly entities. Given that many settlers in West Virginia were of Scots-Irish descent, it is possible that these tales influenced local beliefs, shaping perceptions of Mothman as a harbinger of doom. In this exploration, we will examine several prominent figures in Scots-Irish folklore that share characteristics with Mothman: the Banshee, Bean Seed, the wailing harbinger of death, the Aiad and the dark fairies, the fiery-eyed spirits, the Dullahan, the headless rider of doom, the Feargorta, the phantom of famine, the Fachan, the winged and monstrous figure, the washer at the ford, a foreteller of disaster, the black shuck and spectral hounds, red-eyed beasts of misfortune, the guardian beings of bridges and waterways. Let's start with the Banshee, Bean Seed, the wailing harbinger of death. One of the most famous figures in Irish mythology, the Banshee is a spectral woman whose wailing cries foretell death. While not always described as having wings, her supernatural nature, piercing shriek, and role as a harbinger of disaster make her a close parallel to Mothman. Description and characteristics. The Banshee is often described as a woman in white, gray, or black, sometimes with long flowing hair and glowing red eyes. In some versions, she appears as a winged or bird-like figure, reinforcing her connection to Mothman's flight. She is known for her piercing, unearthly scream, which predicts the death of a family member. In Scottish variations, she sometimes manifests as a hooded figure, eerily similar to Mothman's headless or featureless descriptions. The connection to Mothman. Both entities serve as omens of death or disaster. Both are described as having glowing red eyes and an overwhelming aura of dread. The Banshee's scream can be compared to reports of Mothman's eerie, high-pitched shrieks. Some claim to have heard Mothman's calls before the Silver Bridge collapse, much like the Banshee's warnings before death. The Aiad and the dark fairies, the fiery-eyed spirits. In ancient Irish mythology, Aiad, sometimes called Iod, was a supernatural being associated with fire, death, and the otherworld. Like Mothman, these beings were often depicted with glowing red eyes and served as warnings of impending doom. Description and characteristics. Aiad was described as having burning red eyes that could paralyze mortals who looked upon him. He was often associated with dark fairies, known for appearing before tragic events. Some dark fairies were winged creatures, resembling huge black birds with human-like features. Connection to Mothman. The glowing red eyes of Aiad strongly resemble Mothman's most notable feature. The dark fairy's ability to cause paralysis or dread is similar to the psychological effects reported by Mothman witnesses. Some accounts of Mothman suggest it was a supernatural being, just as Aiad was not of this world. The Dullahan, the headless rider of doom. The Dullahan is a terrifying entity from Irish folklore who foretells death by riding a black horse or driving a spectral carriage. While he is headless in most tales, some versions describe him as having glowing eyes in his severed head, a detail that draws comparisons to Mothman. Description and characteristics. The Dullahan is often headless, carrying his glowing-eyed head under his arm. His appearance signals imminent death, much like Mothman. He travels at unnatural speeds, just as Mothman was said to fly at over 100 miles per hour. Connection to Mothman. Both are associated with premonitions of death and disaster. Mothman's ability to stalk certain individuals before the Silver Bridge collapse mirrors how the Dullahan appears before fatal events. Witnesses who reported feeling overwhelming terror when seeing Mothman might be experiencing a modern interpretation of an ancient fear. The Fear Gorta, the Phantom of Famine. In Irish folklore, the Fear Gorta is a spectral figure that appears before great calamities such as famines and disasters. Description and characteristics of the Fear Gorta. It is described as a gaunt, shadowy figure that brings ill tidings, and it can be seen hovering over roads, bridges, or desolate places. It sometimes appears just before widespread tragedies, much like Mothman was spotted before the Silver Bridge collapse. Connection to Mothman. The Fear Gorta's appearance before major disasters mirrors the Silver Bridge connection. Both figures loom over isolated areas and create a deep sense of unease. The Fachan, the winged and monstrous figure. The Fachan is a one-eyed, winged, and terrifying creature from Scottish legend, resembling a monstrous, bird-like humanoid. Description and characteristics. The Fachan is described as a tall, hunched figure with wings and glowing eyes. It is feared by travelers for its ominous presence and is often associated with bad luck or death. Connection to Mothman. The Fachan's hunched, winged appearance closely resembles Mothman's shape. Both creatures are seen as omens of misfortune. The washer at the ford, a foreteller of disaster. The washer at the ford is a supernatural figure in Irish and Scottish folklore who is seen washing bloody clothes at a river before a great tragedy. Description and characteristics of the washer at the ford. It is described as a ghostly or winged figure seen near rivers before a death occurs. Cries or wails, much like Mothman's eerie screeches, are often heard during sightings. It is connected to bridges and waterways, similar to Mothman's connection to the Silver Bridge. And now, let's move on to another entity's relation to Mothman. The Black Shuck and Spectral Hounds, the red-eyed beasts of misfortune. In Scots-Irish folklore, the Black Shuck and other spectral dogs were said to be red-eyed omens of death, much like Mothman. Description and characteristics of the Black Shuck. It is a large, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It is seen before tragic events, much like Mothman before the bridge collapse. The Black Shuck's connection to Mothman. The glowing red eyes of the Black Shuck mirror Mothman's most famous feature. Both entities instill fear and dread. The Mothman legend has striking parallels with Scots-Irish folklore, particularly with figures like the Banshee, the Dullahan, the Washer at the Ford, and the Fachan. Given West Virginia's deep Scots-Irish roots, it is possible that Mothman is a modern evolution of these Old World omens, continuing the tradition of supernatural harbingers of doom. Whether Mothman is real or folklore revived, its echoes in ancient myths remain undeniable. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for staying with me until the end. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked this episode, then stay tuned because I've got a lot more upcoming episodes on topics including cryptozoology, folklore, ethnobotany, paranormal phenomena, and much more. If those topics sound interesting to you, then please consider subscribing. Until next time, my friends.